Hey everyone, back for another matchup VOD. This time we're going to be looking at Oops All Spells. It's one of, if not the fastest deck in the format. And it's certainly a deck that's been making waves for the past few months, at least since Eternal Weekend. It's possible it's a bit on the downswing due to, at the time of this recording, we're currently in Turbo Tibalt phase of Legacy. But I have a feeling that that's going to be changed via rule adjustment very soon. But either way, this is one of the most focused hyper-fast kill decks in the format. So we're going to go through a few matches. Since this is these matches are probably going to go a lot faster than the ones we've normally covered in the past. If we have time afterwards, I might go through, do like a quick recap of the Legacy season that just ended a little over a week or two ago, and go through the progression of the depths list over the season, transition from Turbo to Rainbow, maybe talk about a couple of its specific matchups against top decks in the format, possible ideas or changes moving forward, some things I've tried this season, and then maybe look at a little bit of the data from the season as I tracked for all of the Rainbow matches for the year, and talk about some outliers and things like that. But first we'll jump right into Oops. Oops is really, like I said, it's hyper-focused. It really only wants to do one thing, which is put its entire deck into the graveyard and bring back Thassa's Oracle for the win. The true bottleneck of the deck is the 8 enablers with the Undercity Informer and the Spy. With the London Mulligan, this style of effect is significantly stronger than you would think it would be otherwise, and the spell lands just gave this deck an added nitro boost to the point where it's been putting up good results for a while at this point. It's not nearly as fragile as you would think with the London Mulligan. It has various backup mechanisms to protect it. A few main deck discard spells, Pact of Negation, and then in the sideboard you see things like Chancellor. And this specific list was from, I think it finished 6th in the Legacy Challenge last weekend, or the weekend before. I just grabbed the highest finishing or most recent list. This version also has Exanic Swarms for protection in the sideboard as well, which is notable for depths because not only can it block a 20/20 if we don't have access to Sujiri Step, we're not really going to bring up Abrupt Decay in versus a deck like this, but it can also shut off, if it gets to attack, it can shut off Stifles, Surgical Extraction, Crop Rotation for block, a variety of things. So that's a card that's not always necessarily there, but it's one to be aware of. This version has the nice Progenitus tech in the sideboard as well. So pretty stock for the most part. Sometimes you see some differentiation as far as the protection cards in the main deck. This one has a couple of therapies and a couple of thought seizes to go with the packs, and Bridge from Below, so that you get some extra use out of the therapies in the yard. Sometimes I've run into Veil of Summer a few times, so sometimes you see a little bit of a mix, but basically the core of the deck is all the 8 key cards, milling the entire deck, and then Dread Return grabs the Thassa's Oracle back. So we'll just jump right into the match. So in the first game, we're lucky enough to be on the play. Did not know what the opponent was on. As usual, I try not to mulligan to the matchups anyway. But this hand in the dark for depths is pretty reasonable. It doesn't have any proactive disruption as far as like discard spell or no turn 2 or anything crazy like that. But it does have a clean path to the turn 3 with Stifle, so we can play a Rainbow land here. Theoretically stifle their first fetch or a Wasteland or something like that, and then we have Stage to play Scrying on 2, and then with the Lotus Petal we have a clean turn 3. So this isn't a great hand by any means, but I think it's a reasonable keep. So pretty easy Confluence go, no reason to play out the Lotus Petal. We're not going to walk into a daze or anything like that. They would have to fetch to get the island, or if they have the island, there's nothing to stifle. So Agadeem is a pretty good dead giveaway that we're playing versus Oops All Spells. They immediately ritual into Cabal Ritual. and play the Spy. So early on in the deck's existence for Oops, there was a world where you could sometimes gamble and try and wait to stifle the Thassa's Oracle. But that was before these lists were kind of tuned. They didn't always have a high number, like a second Cabal Therapy or things like that. Also, the Rainbow Depths list wasn't as well known back then, so you could reasonably expect them to miss with a Cabal Therapy. That's just not really a thing that you can risk doing here, so we kind of have to stifle the Spy. So here, we really don't have a lot of options. It's basically just go get the last piece, play the pedal out, and pass the turn back and hope it's good enough. So the opponent puts Pact on the stack, and that's usually the writings on the wall that they have what they need to go for it here. So an Elvish Spirit Guide and a Simian Spirit Guide later gets the Undercity Informer into play, and another Spirit Guide gets the crack, and basically very similar to Doomsday. Highly recommend to just take a, even if it's kind of frustrated you get run out of the game immediately, take a good look at the list. You never really know what's going to be hiding in there. In this case, the opponent's list is not only on the standard 4 Pact of Negations, but they're also running 4 Veil of Summers too, which is extremely relevant at times. So we can also see that they clearly have 3 Necromoebas, they have the Oracle, and they have the Dread Return, so that's going to be good enough from this spot. Nothing else of significant note from those cards revealed. So that was a pretty good example of the upside of the deck and how strong and powerful Oops All Spells can be. They literally just won through a piece of disruption. They just comboed twice on 1 and 2. I mean, they're obviously not going to always be able to do that, but it's a good indicator of the ceiling that this kind of deck has that can very easily win through 1 piece of disruption. They did have the second combo there, but also they didn't necessarily have to have that. So since Stifle was our only interaction, if they had, say, a Pact instead of the path to the second enabler, that would have also gotten us. So it's a deck that's very easily capable of winning through a piece of disruption. So for sideboarding in this matchup, it's pretty straightforward. We have Ley Lines and Surgicals that come in. There's some cards that are just straight up dead. In this matchup, Not of This World has no text. So the 3 of those can just come out for 3 of the 4 graveyard spells, and basically it's kind of like a personal preference thing as far as what you want to side out. Generally, I take out a Sylvan Scrying. I think the upside of Reclaimer being able to sit on board and shut them down, if you could live for a turn with another piece of disruption. So like say you play the Reclaimer off like a Petal or a Spirit Guide and are able to discard them to stall them for a turn. The Reclaimer then just, unless you happen to draw Bog, the Reclaimer is just like a hard lock on their combo and forces them to try and win with 2 2s and 2 3s. And that's just generally not going to be a plan that is going to be successful on their end. You could make the argument that you should bring in Flusterstorms, especially when we're on the play, but I don't find Flusterstorms to be particularly effective in this matchup. They often have the lands, they have the Spirit Guides, they have the 8 Spirit Guides, and sometimes you can catch a Dark Ritual, but it's not the kind of thing I really want to be relying on. We have enough disruption in the deck on the play between 8 discard spells and 4 crop rotations and the 4 graveyard hate cards and needles and stifles, that we really don't want to be diluting the combo to add like situationally effective cards like that. So for game 2, this is about as good of a hand as we could possibly ask for. I mean, it's not a turn 2, but it has 3 different ways to wipe their yard on the first turn, so they have to get through the Ley Line with either Force of Vigor or Nature's Claim, and then if they do, the Surgical's there, and if somehow they get through that or pack that, the crop rotation for Bog is there too. So this is pretty close to the dream hand. So we put the ley line into play. Pretty easy depths here instead of stage. This isn't, Oops is just not gonna, it's not a deck that's ever really gonna have like a card like Surgical Extraction. So if we're going to end up, if we end up in a situation where we crop away a land, we would want it to be the redundant second legendary land, as opposed to having the stage in play and getting theoretically forced into a situation where we would have to sacrifice a land we'd actually rather keep. So the Petal there is great draw, allows us to put the kill on the table. And in this case, the opponent just mulliganed down pretty far in this game and just didn't have a way to win through the ley line. So a little bit of overkill on the cards that we ended up drawing, but that happens. This is the kind of matchup where, unfortunately, play draw is a really big deal. When they're on the play in game one, we're kind of just at their mercy. And when we're on the play, we have just so much disruption. We can often have multiple pieces of disruption on turn one, and it's just extremely hard for them to win through. So, yeah, it's not the most interesting magic or dynamic, but it kind of is what it is. So the reverse of that is true when we're on the draw post board. In this particular game, they kept a 7. So whenever they keep 7, they're probably like 95 to, it's probably closer to 100% that they're just going to have it on turn 1. So that puts us into a situation where we have to hard mulligan to one of the 2 ley lines and one of the 2 surgicals. And this hand is really not good, but it does have the ley line. On top of that, if we get a turn, we have the ability to, at the very least, if we draw black, we can duress them too. But even if we miss, we have the ability to play Needle and cut off half their enablers by naming the Undercity Informer. And the good thing about the ley line too is, not only do they have to have the answer to it, but in this case, we'll half the time, even if they have the answer, we'll get a turn because Force of Vigor requires them to pass it to us before they can get rid of it. So we're kind of just, this hand is not good. It is an extremely reluctant keep. But basically what we have to do first is just not die. So having the ley line is where we need to be, unfortunately. So here they have the Nature's Claim for the ley line, and Lotus Petal for Dark Ritual, and a Simian Spirit Guide to play the Spy, and the game just ends on the spot. So there's very few pieces. We don't know what their last card was. Maybe if we hard mulliganed a couple times and found one of the 2 surgicals, maybe we win this game. But I don't know. I find it very difficult to send back leyline hands. So that match in particular was a really good demonstration of the power level. In 2 of the 3 games, they won through significant pieces of interaction. Like, they legitimately just comboed twice in 2 turns in the one game, and then they just managed to have 5 mana and Nature's Claim and the Enabler in the other game through a ley line. So it's pretty impressive for the strength of the deck. So for the second match, this hand looks really appealing on the surface. You can go Urborg, pitch Spirit Guide, play Scrying for depths, and then have turn 2 Hexmage depths. But it just kind of packs to any interaction at all. So it's a high risk, high reward hand. I would not fault anyone for keeping this hand. In this case, I happen to ship it. This hand is not great either. The difference here is we get to interact with them on 1 with Stifle, and we have the Reclaimer, at which point the Reclaimer is like a self-contained combo and answer from that point forward. So being on the play, I kept this. So play out the Reclaimer, leave Stifle up, and pass it to the opponent. So they packed for Wild Cantor to filter their mana. black for Cabal Ritual, Undercity Informer, pitch another Spirit Guide and crack. So similar to before, this is an easy must stifle. They have the Pact, so that ends the game on the spot. So this is kind of interesting. It's missing the third piece. It's missing the second half of the combo, but we have the right half of the combo in hand in Dark Depths. It has double Thoughtseize, but no hard heat. Discard spell into play versus Oops All Spells is generally really good, especially if it's not duress. Like Thoughtseize in particular can take both ends, both enablers, and it's just really strong. The Bog in hand is really awkward, which kind of brick walls drawing Crop Rotation is an out to their combo. But we also have the Needle, which can name the Undercity Informer. So I think between double Thoughtseize and Needle and having the Depths, I think this hand is fine, even though the Bog's in hand. So, see, they have 2 black lands, both the Spy and the Informer, Dark Ritual, and Spirit Guide. So, no matter if we can't, in this case, we can't take a creature. If we take either of the creature enablers, they just cast the other one and win. so those are just not cards we can take. We can't take either of the lands because they have 4 mana with just 1. So we're kind of in a spot where we basically have to take mana and hope they don't draw another. So obviously the ritual represents 2 mana and Spirit Guide represents 1. So the only reasonable take here is to take the Dark Ritual and hope they don't draw exactly another Dark Ritual. So they play the Agadeems and set up for following turn. So the Hexmages is an excellent draw. It's going to enable us to put the combo on the table next turn. So here we get to... they drew Narcomoeba for the turn, which is pretty awful draw. But here we get to just take the Spy and then Needle the Informer. So we get to basically put them on needing to draw one of the last 3 Spies and mana before they can actually do anything. So that's what we do. So they play out the second Agadeems. So here we could Thoughtseize them, but that would really only matter if they drew exactly Spy. We could take mana too, but I do not think we should be giving them extra draw steps. So I think we just put the kill on the table and force them to have drawn mana into Spy over the 2 draw steps they had. They did not, so we get to take that one. This hand is great. We have turn 1 discard spell, turn 2 Hexmage, and the dedicated Piece of Fate. So this will lose to a turn 1 with Pact backup, but there's just no way we're ever sending this hand back. So this is the other side of Oops. You see the 7-card hands with protection or that win through a hate card like a Leyline. But then sometimes, just due to the nature of the deck, where they need to have 1 of 8 pieces and the mana to be able to cast it, this is a mull to 4 from them. So this is a pretty easy Undercity Informer here. Just leave a little bit of mana in their hand. They can't even cast the Dark Ritual yet. Unless they packed for Wild Cantor. Same situation as before. We have the protection piece anyway, so there's no reason not to just put the kill on the table. And that ends that match. So since these are generally the matches are generally very similar to this, and since they're going really fast, I'll go through one more real quick. So in this particular case, we're playing against Viverus, who, for those who may not know him, is Alex McKinley. He writes for theepicstorm.com, usually on TES, but in this particular case, took Oops All Spells for a spin. Yeah, I mean, this hand is a little... Yeah, it's not great, but it has full path to the combo, disruption piece with Needle, acceleration with the Spirit Guide. So I think this is a keep. So I was chatting with Alex, and when Alex put a Dark Ritual on the stack off Agadeem, I asked if he had it. He said he did. So I scooped it up, and we went to game 2. Yeah, that is one of the biggest appeals to this deck, is there's just so many decks in the format that just can't stop that, especially when that deck's on the play. So this hand, while it does technically have a full path to the combo and can put a Reclaimer into play on turn 1 if it wants to, can't cast a discard spell, can't really interact. So that's not a recipe for a hand you can keep against Oops All Spells. This hand, on the other hand, is significantly better. Thanks to the London Mulligan, we're able to put this Bog right back into the deck. So we not only have a turn 2 combo with Urborg Depths Hexmage, but we also have the Petal to turn on the crop rotation. So this is actually a mistake playing the Urborg here. The Depths should have been the first land on the similar to in the first match, where if we did have to cast the crop rotation, we'd want it to be the redundant legendary land, not the Urborg. But in this case, if we do have to cast it, it's probably not going to matter. The crop rotation probably decides the game one way or the other on the spot, but just, trying to get into good habits. So turn Timber into Wild Canter on the other side, and Lotus Petal pass. So basically that just says that they do not have the ability to beat a crop rotation at the moment. So pretty easy Hexmage Depths and pass it back. So now with the combo on the table, they're forced to go for it. So we get to look at the cards. See how the opponent sideboarded. So it's worth noting that in this case they did bring in Chancellors, which are really kind of brutal for game 3. It's something we're gonna have to be aware of, that if we're banking on the Surgical being the answer to the turn 1 combo, we hopefully have a Spirit Guide or something like that to go with it, because they're there. They also had Swarms as well. So, but in this case, we get to crop bog them, and that was good enough. So back on the draw post board, again, there's really no hand that we can keep reasonably that doesn't have a dedicated hate card in these games on the draw. They're just going to have it on turn 1 at too high of a clip. So even though that hand had completely reasonable cards, would be a keep in almost any other matchup, here it just doesn't do anything. Similar here, we have 3 pieces of interaction, a path to the combo, and it's just not a hand we can justify keeping, so that has to go back too. and this one meets the criteria. So question here is what actually goes on the bottom. So I think the most important cards are obviously the Stifle, the Surgical, the Depths, and the Urborg. So the question from there is what's the last keep? I think the Petal's a pretty easy bottom, and I think we'd rather have, well, yeah, I think we have to keep the mana for Stifle, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to keep Petal. Since we're on the draw here, we're going to be able to play out the Confluence anyway, so I think it's a scrying in the Petal that we bottom here. And just, we either win the game with the Surgical, or we draw into the stage, or Depths, or Crop Rotation, or not Depths, Hexmage. So we'll eventually get to the other piece here. So heavy mulligan from the other side again, which is the pretty clear downside from this type of shell. So here, since they started so slow and mulled so heavily, it's pretty easy Thoughtseize. We get to take the Spy and kind of in cruise control from here. We're going to have multiple pieces of interaction up at all times. I'll even draw the extra Crop Rotation. So no reason to get cute and play the Needle or anything like that. Just pass it, and if they do anything, we have all the interaction up. And if they don't, we have the win. So they do, despite mulling to 3 and having their Enabler taken, they're still able to go for it on turn 4 in the face of a Crop Rotation kill. Which is kind of crazy, and again showcases the power level of the cards in this deck. Once again, we see that the sideboard plan was the Swarms and the Chancellors to try and shut off early interaction and just try to win on the spot, which I think is a good plan. But here, obviously, we can just bog them or Surgical them. So since we have the Crop Rotation for the win too, even if they didn't scoop here, we just use the Surgical. That ends the match. So these aren't necessarily the most interesting games, and yeah, it's just a matchup that's probably hovering between like 3 and 5% of the meta. So it's just something that felt like we could go over it really quick. We're through most of the top decks at this point anyway, so maybe I'll revisit some of the more difficult ones. For somebody that was in the comments, I forget the username off the top of my head, but I did check, and I do have a couple of matches that were played against Ninjas in the last few weeks of the league, so I should be able to put that one together over the next couple of weeks. But I'm probably not going to do a ton of the other graveyard decks, or maybe I'll do the rest of them all as one, because the matchups are all kind of in a similar space, like kind of similar boarding, kind of similar play patterns, and they're all pretty favorable for Depths. Like Hogak is an extremely favorable matchup, Black-Red is a favorable matchup, yeah, Dredge is a really favorable matchup. So there's not too much play to these matchups. I mean, like, there's some things, like against Hogak, playing around Assassin's Trophy, or knowing when to do so, that kind of thing, you know, whether or not you think your Black-Red opponent has like a Magus of the Moon in the sideboard. So there's like some little things here and there, but for the most part, a lot of it's just really straightforward. But maybe I'll do them like all as one, where I'll cover 3 matches, and it can be like one of each, and talk about like some specific things that come up in each matchup. But yeah, I just don't know how useful these graveyard shell matchup VODs are going to be. So in this case, since this went really fast, we can talk about the Depths lists. So to start the season, it was something similar to this shell that I was on. This was kind of more or less stock turbo depths at the time. Like everybody has their few slots that they like to mess with, but this is what I was on, and I think this was reasonably effective. It was fine. It kind of just got to the point where there's 3 Nihilist Worlds hiding out there at the bottom, in case anyone was wondering where the missing cards are. So one of the ways I always tried to build my depths decks, like dating back to the initial old school bug depths list with brainstorms and everything, was to make sure that these decks just beat the crap out of combo decks. Like, I did not want to have unfavorable combo matchups, and for the most part Turbo was pretty decent at that. The issue is, like, it kind of struggles against certain combo shells, like towards the end of the run with this list. Like, TES wasn't like great. There's some other issues, but when decks like Doomsday started to pop up in particular, this shell is just not great in that scenario. So once you start adding a couple of lists and you're like, okay, well, this isn't going well, and then a couple of the like show and tell lists started to adapt. So whereas like the old school like mono blue, or maybe like blue with a light splash Omni lists used to be really favorable, because discard kind of chopped up like a deck that really wanted to have like a 2-piece combo plus another piece, but they started to incorporate green, so now they were running like 4 copies of Veil of Summer, 3 or 4 copies of Veil of Summer main deck, and the blue-green version became a little bit harder. And then a blue-white version got made as well that was like playing Teferis and also bringing in Swords to Plowshares out of the sideboard, and had like Karakas and Venzer and things like that. So it was kind of, so you had these combo matchups such as like the show and tell lists that were adapting, and TES and Doomsday, that were all kind of hard matchups, and depending on the variations. And turbo shells already have enough issues on the fair side, so when you're already signing up for struggling, or at least having a tough matchup against the players that are willing to show up with Death and Taxes, Maverick, Esper Vial, and even to a certain extent like Snow, like, if you're going to struggle in a decent portion of the fair matchups like that, or at least the white-based fair matchups, you really don't want to be struggling against some of the more popular combo decks too. That's just not like a place you can really live and do well. So again, it's not that the list was performing terribly. It was still fine, like still having reasonable success with it, but I didn't like that the combo percentages were eroding a certain amount. So the first thing I tried to do with this list was to basically incorporate some additional disruption to help there. So I messed with Mindbreak traps for a little while, and that did help in some spots. Like, there was some gotcha moments against Doomsday, but that's just not a reliable thing. Like, they can play around that if they know it's there. And obviously it was very good against TES, but it just doesn't do what you needed to do in a lot of those other spots. So like an Omnitel list does not have to play into a Mindbreak trap, and Doomsday in particular does not have to play into Mindbreak trap, and certain other spots where they have powerful game-ending spells that they can play, it's just not something they have to play into. Elves does not have to play a Natural Order as its 3rd plus spell, unless it gets boxed into that sort of situation. So there's just a lot of spots where it's not great. So from there, I basically, I started testing the Stifle list as a joke, but one of the things I did want to do was start incorporating blue cards back into the list, especially Flusterstorm. Flusterstorm's the big one. So when I did start messing around with Stifle, it surprised me in how good it actually was. Like, the format is just so bomb heavy on 2 and 3. Like, delaying Dreadhorde and Oko and Euro, even for a turn, is just such a big game. And obviously, we're a pretty fast combo deck too. We're not hyper fast like the Oopses and the Turbo Tybalts are, but we're fast, and just, essentially like pseudo time walking them with Stifle is just, it's big. So, well, the 4 I started testing with was obviously a joke, and I didn't expect that to stick. I was pleasantly surprised by how good the card actually was, and even though I only ever ran 1 in old school Bug Depths, 2 felt very good. So when I went down from 4 to 3, it still felt like too many, and you really want some number of proactive disruptive pieces for Wasteland, like needles. Like you can't just go to 0 needles or 1 needle when Delver's the best deck best or second best, depending on whose argument you want to. I would argue it's the best deck in the format, so you can't really be shaving too much, because you're signing up to really struggle anytime they find 2 or more wastelands. But yeah, that 2 number was the sweet spot, where between the Stifles and the Flusterstorms, you really have game against basically everything. It's very, very infrequent where the Stifles aren't going to be good. Sure, there are matchups, like you're really not in love with having them like against like the Echo Karn decks of the world, where sure they do have a use here and there. You could like stifle a Karn activation, that kind of thing, or an Emery activation. They're still kind of not great against like the Chalice Shells, but they're functional. And the Flusterstorms, on the other hand, are just bombs out of the sideboard, where now you have game against all kinds of sorcery speed, just game-ending spells. So you have additional ways to fight Show and Tell on top of the discards. You have additional ways to fight Doomsday on top of the discards. And then just a variety of other spots where they're good. They're great against Assassin's Trophy decks. They even work against Swords to Plowshares. It's not that hard to navigate them into a situation where they only have a couple of mana left, and you can stop swords that way too. So they're just good across a variety of matchups, and they also just power up some of the other cards in the list. So if we look at the current, what is running currently for Rainbow, like not only do they have that functionality, but a card like Surgical Extraction, which I think, obviously just like it's a very good card in like the Oops matchups and the Graveyard matchups, but Surgical's lost a fair bit of value recently. But once you actually have 8 discard spells to proactively take cards to be able to Surgical them, and then you have the reactive Flusterstorms to be able to Surgical behind too, it's just kind of crazy. Like if you snipe 1 Doomsday with a discard spell, now suddenly your Surgical is must counter, the game ends. If you Flusterstorm a Doomsday, it's just, instead of 8, you now have 11 ways to get their Doomsday into the graveyard. And the Flusterstorm often gets their Doomsday into the graveyard even through their counter magic, which is really nice. And then in other matchups, Surgical can even be used to up the Flusterstorm count. So against, like, say, Snow, if they leave 2 or 3 mana up and pass, and you feel like they have the Plow, but you have Flusterstorm Surgical, you can go after something else that's in their graveyard, whether that's Uro or another relevant card of some kind, to up the Flusterstorm count in response to the Plow. So if they Plow and go down to, like, say, 1 or 2 mana, and you think that they can maybe counter one of the Flusterstorm copies with a Force and then pay for the other kind of thing, you can just Surgical up the Flusterstorm count as well. So it's just adding these little extra value, and Surgical is kind of like a card that's only so. Like, that's part of the problem with the Snow matchup is, like, yes, it can hit Uro. Maybe if you're lucky, you can exile their Swords to Plowshares, but it's still kind of narrow. And if they end up doing something like, curving Ice Fang into Oko and or Teferi, and that's kind of what they have going on in that game, you're looking at your Surgical Extraction in hand and kind of cringing at its narrow applications that just, you just didn't run into the right side of their deck in this particular match. But now it still has text, and that it can help work with another card in your deck. So it's a nice little synergy. Not uncommon to set up scenarios where you basically have 2 or 3 instants you can play, whether that's Crop Rotation, Surgical, Flusterstorm, Decay, something, Stifle. There's just a variety of ways where you can up the count, play through a removal spell, which is nice. So this is kind of where the list is at the moment. And that was kind of the progression through the season. So it's kind of turbo, and then turbo with traps, and I had a couple of extra collector roofs at one point, and then into rainbow to address some of the deficiencies in the combo matchups. And I'll pull up my data tracking sheet in a minute, and you'll be able to see like specifically just how big of a difference and impact the blue splash actually made in these combo matchups. So, other things that I want to test going forward include like somehow jamming. I mean, the biggest issue is space. So whenever I talk about these ideas, they're all fighting over cards that are just extremely effective. Like right now, the main deck is it's just really tight. So like you could argue that you could trim maybe a Not of This World, maybe a Reclaimer, but I do not think I want to go down on acceleration. The format is so fast and the cards are so powerful. I can't see going down on acceleration. I can't see going down on discard. The proactive disruption is kind of just what forces your tutors through, forces your combo through, removes their answers. Like I don't see it. The needle stifle space is you kind of need those kind of effects, and we're already kind of at the floor as far as lands we can get away with playing and tutors that we can get away with running. So I don't think there's a ton of space. I do want to mess around with moving a Flusterstorm to the main deck over a Not of This World and see what kind of impact that has, maybe open up a slot that way. But then once you get into the sideboard, you kind of have like these 4 slots that address artifacts and the artifact enchantment shells, like in between Oof, Force of Vigor, and Decay, and you can shift those numbers around a little bit, but you probably really even want 5 more so than 4. So we're kind of already hitting the bottom there. Safekeeper's really, really necessary against the D&Ts of the world, and even like the Miracles in Snow. It's really strong. I really like the Graveyard Hate setup because they cover different bases but then come together against the Graveyard Shells. It's just really, really strong, and I'm closer to wanting to play a 4th Flusterstorm than a 3rd. Maybe you could argue Karakas can go. Depths is not really a popular deck at all right now. So maybe that's a spot that could be messed with. I'm not comfortable with that, but maybe that's just because I've been playing these shells for so long. I'm used to playing versus Depths and lands and TNT and like Sneak and Show and all these lists that where the card has a lot of value, but maybe that's just like maybe it's time to just test without it for a little bit and see if that still holds, or if that's just me having some long-term biases from playing the deck for as long as I have. But I definitely want to experiment with moving a Fluster to the sideboard. Cards that we could test, I think adding a second Force of Vigor or a second Collector Oof is probably the first thing that would get added. Those cards are just so strong. Like, if I know it's not really super present, but if Moonstompy ever comes back around, we're going to want the second Force of Vigor. Collector Oof is just so good against TES, Karn Echo, all those kind of shells that I would love to have a second copy. I would love to add Ghost Quarter to this list. Yeah, it doesn't come up too often because the deck's not super popular, but the green post issue with only having one wasteland, or even versus like lands, having the ability to come at it with 2 different names and freely being able to name Needle. Doesn't come up as often since we're down to 2 needles, but it's still a thing. And against green post, if they slam their own needle on wasteland, it's nice to have like additional outs to Glacial Chasm that don't involve waiting it out. Cards that I did test recently that were not very good included Opposition Agent. Card was just so slow. It's kind of a gotcha thing. Doesn't really fill in with the game plan at all, and oftentimes they're already fetched once or twice underneath of it anyway. It just wasn't doing very much. This deck already does a pretty good job at turning off their removal. Sometimes the Reclaimer's a 3/4, so like Lightning Bolt the Hex Mage doesn't come down until you're ready to combo more often than not anyway. So this deck does a pretty good job at turning off opposing removal and putting a card in that just turns it on. That doesn't really synergize with the main game plan much. Just turned out to not be great. I think maybe it's like a one-of in the sideboard where it could come in against something like Green Post and shut a ton of their tutors down, that kind of thing. It's possible, but I don't even think it's as strong as the existing options we have there. So that ended up not being great. I tried Praetor's Grasp. One of the things that a bunch of people have pointed out to me regarding the rainbow list is the missing 4th and 5th colors, even though we have 15 white sources, 13 red sources. And it's just, I just haven't found cards that are as powerful as the existing options. But one of the things I tried recently was a couple of copies of Praetor's Grasp, so that we could strip cards from the opponent's deck and play them. I thought it would be, at the very least, it would get some great screenshots if I could be attacking the opponent with their own Dreadword or that sort of fun stuff. But that is it's just so slow and clunky at black 1 that it's also if it could strip out the Thassa's Oracle out of Doomstick, just went on the spot. I thought there was it was a card worth testing that would enable me to make use of some of the additional colored sources, but it just wasn't good enough. But yeah, there's always some cards, and I'm sure there will be new cards printed with every set that are worth testing. So it's nice to have all 5 colors as options if it really comes to it for stuff to test. So I guess the last thing real quick, that's kind of where the list is and where my head with it is. I think Depths is positioned okay. I don't think you could justify playing it over Rogue Snow or a couple of other lists if you're proficient with all of those, but I think it's still really strong. It's probably somewhere in the 5 to 10 range if you're good with it, and it's a strategy I enjoy, so when I do come back from break, it's where I'll start for sure. So just a quick overview of the league. I did for this season with Rainbow track all of my matches, which I thought would be interesting thing to look over afterwards. So we'll only look at the top 40. Obviously it's Legacy. There's a ton of lists that got labeled under Rogue, everything from Dead Guy Ale to Solidarity to Enchantress, everything you could possibly imagine. People can and will, it's casual format at heart, people can and will run whatever they want from time to time. So I'll just start around 40. The rest of the sample sizes were just, even 40 is way too small, but the rest of them are, once you start getting into 2 and 1 matchup, they're not really even worth looking at. So in here, normal small sample size caveats apply. Within this group, I think it would be accurate to say that Esper Vial is the hardest matchup in this section. So it coming back at 50%. Yeah, I don't even think it's 50%. I think if I played, 50 matches versus Esper Vial, it would be sub 50%. Yeah, same thing with Ninjas. That's a super small sample size. There's no way in the world Ninjas is a favorable matchup. I think that's probably 50-50 at best, probably significantly worse, but obviously anything can happen in 7 matches. So that sort of thing happened. Not too much going on here. I think the next hardest matchup in this group of lists is Moonstompy, but that list hasn't actually been really all that popular. You can see by the percentages of the meta that these are kind of just decks that you're only going to see around 1 out of 100 matches, maybe even less. So nothing too interesting in here. Grixis Delver is interesting. Normally Delver for Depths is a really favorable matchup. Generally, Depths usually is ahead against the Delver lists, unless the Delver lists are really preparing. Delver can make itself favored. It is Delver. It can be favored against basically anything it wants to if it chooses to dedicate the space, but it just generally can't. Like, I guess there have been time periods where it could afford to do that, such as like the Wrenn and 6 era, where it had the whole crop rotation Karakas package in the sideboard. So if it does something like that, but generally Depths is ahead of Delver, barring significant resources being dedicated to the matchup. But Grixis Delver is a little bit different because they have a light touch discard. They generally do have Brazen Borrowers nowadays, so really small sample size, but of all the Delver lists, Grixis is the one from the Depths perspective that we would least like to be playing against. So as we move up into the next group of decks, similar stuff still. The sample sizes still aren't big enough up in this area. Maverick is not anywhere near this. That is a significantly worse matchup than that. Just some good variants on that. But like we were talking about with the shift to Rainbow, you really start to see it in this section, whereas the overall win percentages versus the combo decks, you have Doomsday here, Blackwood Reanimator, Omnitel, Hogak, TES. So the win percent, it's basically made all of those matchups favorable. Like, even if you want to make the argument that these percentages are a little slanted, just due to my level of experience with the format, even if you want to shave off 10 or 15% off these percentages, you're still going to end up in a good spot. So I think the shell has set Depths up in a way where it's just very good against the combo decks. You can kind of see that, similar to Grixis, the Death Shadow list that has a little bit of discard and Brazen Borrowers is one of the tougher spots as far as like a Tempo or Delver-ish shell. You can see the Swords to Plowshare deck's a little bit lower. Pokepile is an interesting one in that it's sort of a control deck, but it's got the 4 Stifles and the 4 Wastelands and Urros. It's actually a really interesting matchup. I think it's probably sneakily one of the better shells in the format, but it's not super heavily played, so I don't know that there's really much that we want to worry about addressing there. So you get into even elves. So you can just see the combo percentages as far as the results have just been very good. So from there we get into the most heavily played lists, and the sample sizes are a little bit heavier here, so a little bit more reliable. Basically, again, with the Delver shells, like Blue-Red Delver is another one that will generally can and does have like a Brazen Borrower or Vapor Snag, something in the main deck, some main deck answer to it, to the 2020 where Rug just does not, at least in the main deck, generally does not have Bounce Spell. They're generally reliant on trying to block Oko or get Oko down fast enough to gain life in Oko, but that's just generally not a reliable plan. So just meta-specific stuff. This DNT number is not what I would say DNT is right now. A lot of the matches mixed into that number were of the Yorion variety this year, and I think that specific change put a huge dent in its Depths matchup, like lowering, like, yes, they added the extra Karakas and some extra paths, so their removal numbers are kind of the same, but reducing the frequency that they're going to draw Wasteland is a big deal. Reducing the frequency that they're going to draw Flicker Wisp naturally is a big deal, and the extra cards that they're adding generally aren't nearly as impactful as just drawing extra Flicker Wisps, drawing extra Wastelands. So that kind of bumped this up. Traditionally, I'm like in the 55% range versus 60 card DNT, and I would anticipate that returning to that range if the 60 card is the norm, which it seems to have been for a while, especially since Iran won the showcase. So Snow is another one. I would really like to find a better way to attack Snow, but it just hits from so many different angles that it's hard, and the shells shift around. Like, Snow's so all encompassing that you could be 8 to 10 different cards off. Are they the combo version that's running things like Hull Breacher? Are they more in on Ice Fang? Are they the kind that has Assassin's Trophy? There's just so many little small pieces. And then even within like the core shell, like Oko and Uro are just like, they both have the ability to put them over 20, which is annoying, but they're different cards that require very different answers. And then on top of that, they're running their Swords to Plowshares deck with Karakas generally, so those all require like different kinds of answers. So from the depths perspective, what are you actually doing? Like, are you bringing in multiple surgicals to try and fight the graveyard interaction in Uro and maybe try to catch their plows? Are you leaving needles in for Oko, but they may not even have that many Okos, depending on the shell, and then they could just have Teferi too, which Needle is not very good against. Are you bringing in Flusterstorms, which are pretty good against their counter magic and plows, but then they could just have a creature planeswalker heavy setup in any particular game? Like, there's just a lot of interaction, and it doesn't always line up neatly. You can just get into these spots where you have, what are you doing with Stifle in the matchup, where you have a Stifle for like an Oko, and then they have the Teferi, after they went over 20 life, or you have a Flusterstorm for the Plow, and they play the Teferi, or you have Stifle for Oko, and they have Plow. Like, our answers don't necessarily line up cleanly to all the different problems that they put on the table. So, I've seen people run Steely Resolve, which I think in this particular matchup is pretty good, but I have a hard time justifying the sideboard space for that, because it's just so bad in some of the other spots. You need that kind of card to be good in. Like, you need Steely Resolve to be good versus the Death and Taxes of the world. And if they get Mom plus Flyer, and you can no longer target your 2020 with Sejiri Step, you're just locked out of the game. Or very close to locked out of the game. And that's just too big of a downside to try and use a card that really only has text in a couple of spots. Like, I don't know how many matchups I would actually want Steely Resolve in, and Snow would be at the top of that list, but I just don't think it does enough to justify the space. And then I think it's actively harmful. Someone actually brought one in against me a couple of weeks ago in the mirror, and the game lasted like 35 extra turns because no one could get their 2020 through, and eventually the opponent ended up having to abrupt decay their own Steely Resolve to try and win, and ended up in a really neat endgame sequence. But yeah, there are issues, and that's a similar thing that can happen in the lands matchup, as because theoretically, they would have Basivith and Karakas and all these cards where you would think that Steely Resolve would be great. But then if you do that and they manage to get their own 2020 into play too. So when you have a sideboard card that you really need to be effective in multiple matchups, and in several of the matchups where you would want that kind of effect, it's just not great. I don't think you can use it. So I don't really know how or what cards could be tested to try and make the Snow matchup better. If anybody has any ideas, I'd love to hear it. If anybody's curious, the worst percentage, which didn't show up on this list that I had, was 33%. 1-2'd versus Dead Guy Ale. I'd like to personally thank Phil Gallagher for making those 3 matches happen that all happened in the week or so after he posted a YouTube video about that deck. So that was fun. But that would be the worst result. But obviously not enough matches to make this list. Whenever you get into this data stuff, you run into situations like, I know just off the top of my head, this Black-Red Reanimator 20% in game 1 is really funny. I had a streak of 14 consecutive die roll losses to that. which is not where you want to be in that particular matchup. Yeah, some other stuff here and there. You're just always gonna run into those kind of outliers whenever you're dealing with this sort of thing. But yeah, I had a good time this season up until the end. I think the meta got a little bit too repetitive. The play patterns are, for a lot of these matchups, are just not something I particularly think is the greatest. So I'm hopeful that something's going to change the dynamic of the format, whether that's, I don't know, maybe whether the meta just completely adjusts because Tibalt is broken. Maybe that puts a dent in Snow, or maybe Oko goes, or maybe something happens. I'm hopeful that after a bit of a break, something happens and revitalizes the format. But until then, I think I still have a decent amount of matches from the last few weeks of the league. So I'll probably do the ninjas that someone requested, and I don't know if there's anything else. I've done all of these. I guess elves is a possibility. I haven't done elves yet. Maybe I'll do a tribal one because I haven't done goblins either. So maybe I can do a all-encompassing graveyard one and all-encompassing tribal decks is maybe where I'll go next. But a little over an hour for now, so I think I'm going to call it here. If anyone has any thoughts, suggestions on multicolor cards to try when I come back, different kind of content you would like that's not necessarily game reviews, anything you can think of, just let me know and I'll try to do it. Until then, take it easy, everyone.